But first, we're going to talk about the world happening, and we're going to talk about trend watching. So as a biologist, supply chain media is looking at trends, and we're watching all the kind of trends and happenings in the world. So it's quite a disturbing world in the last 2 years, I would say. And but some things might be expected, and some things are not to be expected. So here you see an overview of the phrases of CEOs and CFOs talking about all kind of trends during calls with the quarterly earnings. So this overview is based on all the wordings being said by CEOs and CFOs during their calls, what's happening in the world. And as you can see, there's an economic slowdown. You see it in the upper right corner. And to the right, you see a lot of CEOs talk about supply chain. And they talk about uncertainty. And of course, they talk about inflation. And it's good to see that, there are, in this world, we are playing in as supply chain professionals, and more supply chain is on the agenda of the boardroom leaders. And of course, you see also invasion of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine is on that list of phrases. But as supply chain professionals, and especially supply chain media, we want to dig deeper to make some sense of what is happening in the world. So as you can see here, we created an overview of ripple effects of major events in the supply chain in the world. So on the lower left side, you see COVID-19 happening early 2020. And as a result of that, there were lockdowns in factories, lockdowns at home. So lockdowns at home were causing a huge raise in e-commerce. But lockdowns in factory meant shortages. So there is a lack of supplies, and there was a lot of shortages. And as a result of that, in the end, the prices were raising, fuel prices were going up, and there was already talking about inflation in the late 2021. And now you see a decline. Stores are opening up, and you see a decline in e-commerce, and even Amazon just announced a layoff of a huge amount of people, not in the warehouse, but in general. So you will see, I wouldn't say the bubble of e-commerce has burst, but it's not an endless growth anymore. And now we talk about recession coming up, possibly, and what we saw last year, war in Ukraine in February 24th. And of course, the war in Ukraine has all kinds of impacts in business. You see a lack of gas supplies, and now it's hitting the global economy. Some people might say that the war in Ukraine was a black swan, but it wasn't. The NATO already played out different kind of scenarios in the fall of 2021. And this slide is showing a slide of different kind of scenarios. And as you see on the top of this slide is from early February of 2022. The wargaming community created this slide of scenarios already before it was happening. So it was amazing to see that the wargaming community, these are former military people or enthusiasts playing war games, they already created this slide with all kinds of different scenarios. So for them, it was no surprise at all that Russia invaded Ukraine. So as you see here, that it was no surprise for the wargaming community. It was no surprise for NATO. But even the wargaming community accelerated very rapidly. And this was a slide of March last year. And as you can see, this scenario thinking has evolved. And you can see the invasion and occupation in the middle, starting out all kinds of effects. And you see down these bubbles explaining what could happen next. And you see the likelihood of all kinds of consequences happening next. And this kind of thinking is now getting into companies. Now I'm talking to companies who are applying this way of thinking, of scenario building, for their own sake. So what will be happening if China might invade Taiwan? That kind of thinking. So this kind of thinking has evolved in the last year based on what's happening in Ukraine, sadly enough, but it's a sign that people should think differently. And we're going to talk also with 4 experts later on, but we did a survey among chief supply chain officers of global companies, of multinationals, and we asked them, what are the two major trade-offs and megatrends happening in this world. And last year, number one, digitalization was clearly the main megatrend impacting the business. But now we see things changing. A year later, and you see the second bar, that's the orange, that's this year, the results. Now sustainability and scarcity of materials, that's the main issue on the long term. So the chief supply chain officers see scarcity of raw materials and sustainability as an adjacent topic, as the main megatrend impacting their business on the long term. And that's good to see how that is happening, because all this strategic thinking also implies that the leaders should need different kind of skills. And another question we did in the same survey among the chief supply chain officers was, what are the two major important skills for supply chain leaders today? And the number one was resilience and scenario building. That's number one. And the second one is strategic thinking and transformation thinking. So, you know, what does it all imply for your business as a whole, and how should you change? And the third one, also very important, is strategic execution and alignment. Do we know what's happening, and do all my colleagues know, or all my partners in the supply chain know what's happening, and how are we going to transform and change in all this?